for our speaker. So today's presentation is part of an extended series our club's been hosting about economic and workforce development, which was something we decided to do as part of our strategic planning a few years ago. Martha Bentley from the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development was our first speaker in that series. And her topic was the state's 10-year development strategy. So now, nearly 5 years later, we are getting a progress report on that strategy from Phoenix McLaughlin, who is the department's director of strategy implementation. And I'm so glad you're here. And I know you had to come all the way from Lewiston to Augusta to here and back to Lewiston, so thank you. And I'm glad it's not snowing today. In addition, Phoenix is going to talk to us, but I want to tell you a little bit about his background. In addition to his work with the strategy, he manages various Maine jobs and recovery plan initiatives, and he previously led the department's business incentives programs. He also managed special projects for the Commissioner and the Office of Business Development, including creating the Maine Forest Bioproducts Advanced Manufacturing Tech Hub, which sounds like something that could be a subject in its own right. He received a BA in International Political Economy from Colorado College and a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. So please come up and tell us all about progress. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for having me. I do like doing, oh, it's almost vertical here. Yeah. Let's see if that's any better. I'll try to talk right into it. So yeah, thank you for having me. I do like doing these events around the state, and it's always great when somebody reaches out to me asking for a presentation on this. That makes it a lot easier. I can just come here and find a group that's so engaged into these kinds of things. And it's very fitting that a predecessor of mine, Martha, was here to, it sounds like, kick this series off, and now here I am. We're about halfway through that 10-year planning period and can give you a little bit of an update. I will say just a quick little history, I suppose, in terms of the report itself before I get into my presentation. So the original strategy was published at the end of 2019. Obviously, things changed quite a bit in the months following that as COVID-19 came onto the scene. So a lot changed with Maine's economy, and you'll see that really in some of the charts that I put up in almost every one. 2020 is kind of a breaking point. In some ways a good way, in some obviously not so good. But that changed a lot of things, and we were able to do a lot of the original ideas in that strategy, in part due to federal relief funds. And so now, roughly, I guess at the time it would have been about 4 years into it, they decided it was time to update the report itself. The overall kind of structure of it is the same, but updating some of those action items, which we'll talk about towards the end of my presentation. So without further ado, I'll get into it here. You might have to click on the presentation once for this to start working again. Okay, so yeah, formatting on those numbers got a little screwy. I'm just going to talk about some of the goals and the progress on those goals, as well as a few other kind of economic stats that are interesting. And I'll also then get into the sort of strategy and action setup of the report itself. And so on your tables, you have just the executive summary printed out for you. So that doesn't give the full details. If you really want to read the full thing, you can scan the code on the back and look on our website, but that should give you a good little outline. So it is all structured around a vision for Maine's economy generally, which is, I guess I don't need to read the whole thing, but it's just broadly aiming for a more prosperous state by 2030, to sum it up briefly. I will try to go through all this relatively quickly, so I can talk about this for an hour and a half. So trying to keep it to under 30 minutes, I'll move through this somewhat breezily if I don't get carried away. So how do we know if we're actually going to achieve that nice sounding vision, right? So we needed to establish some clear goals, something that we can measure. And so the first of those three is around increasing real wages, which means adjusted for inflation, which, as we've learned, is a pretty important adjustment to make. So the goal was to achieve 10% growth by 2030, and this is the statewide average wage. And what we saw is a huge leap in 2020. And again, for sake of time, I don't want to get so far into it. That jump in 2020 itself was a little bit due to kind of data, the way the data is calculated in terms of who is counted and who is not. So when a lot of people couldn't work that year, that affected it. But as we saw in the years since, now we're back to very much full employment. Unemployment has been quite low for a few years now. And that wage level has maintained. Of course, now we want to see it growing again. Currently, we're at about 9.7% increase over 2018, which is a little frustrating for me. It'd be great to just get that extra $100 and hit the 10% now. But anyways, the point is we want this to keep going up, of course, and improving the wages, since that's most people's fundamental income. Now, I do want to point out this does vary by county, of course. And so what I have up now is the colors at the top. So that's blue on the very top, which is Cumberland County, which is the highest for the state. The lowest is Piscataquis County at the bottom there. Knox is that orange line in the bottom middle, and then the statewide average is the green one. So I do want to make a point about this because, again, this is only wages. So only people who are getting a paycheck show up in this. And I do think that's important to point out because actually Knox County, if you look at income overall, Knox County has above average for the state because that's retirement income, pensions, investment income, business ownership, proprietor's income, stuff like that doesn't get calculated in wages. So that's just one cautionary point. But I think it remains true overall that we don't only want to see the statewide average go up. We want to see wages improving across the board and ideally, converging up towards the highest. And so wages have improved in Knox County, which is great, but also obviously there's more to go in terms of reaching even higher levels, I think. So goal number 2 was to increase the value of what we sell by 10%. And what that is getting at is, well, in terms of how it's calculated, it's GDP divided by the number of workers. It's kind of getting at productivity is another way to put it in economic terms. What that's getting at is really, how well valued is the work that people are putting into whatever they're making or doing or selling from Maine. And that really it's kind of the core of economic development in a lot of ways, because that's what generates the revenue and the income and everything that is needed to kind of support a more prosperous community. And so that's a pretty fundamental one. And again, here we have seen a major increase starting in 2020 that has sustained fairly well since then. And again, this is one where we have slightly exceeded that 10-year goal, but of course we do want to see that continue to increase. And the way that you kind of get there is by improving people's skill through education and training, through investing in new technologies, new equipment, and just newer ways of doing things and improving your business and approach to producing whatever it is you're doing or making for the market. The reason I have this set up this way, you'll notice it's a much longer time scale. This goes back to 2004, and I'm also comparing it to the U.S. average as a whole. The reason I want to show that is, excuse me, although we did obviously have a big increase in the last few years, we do have quite a ways to go to catch up with the nation. For a variety of reasons, Maine's a rural state, the way we're kind of set up, the way GDP is measured, likely won't ever converge entirely with the U.S., but there is a big gap there. And the reason I have this longer time period is Maine was totally stagnant on this point for about a decade. And that, I think, was felt in a lot of towns. Nothing else, just kind of that type of thing can kind of manifest in, having a little bit less dollars to invest in your downtown. Things are sometimes a little hard to make ends meet is how that kind of thing can manifest. And it was a long period, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe we can get into in the questions, maybe if that's of interest. But the point is, fortunately we have seemed to kind of turn a corner in that we are increasing again in that measure. And again, it does vary a lot by county. Some caution with this, the way it's measured, it can bounce around a lot when looking at the county level. But this is one where Knox has seen growth as well. In fact, every county has seen, over this 5-year period, has seen growth. But again, the nature of it, it kind of bounces around a little bit. So the third one, and one that I find a lot of people have heard of, if not the others, is this goal to add 75,000 people to Maine's workforce by 2030. It's a big number. Yes. Key point that I want to emphasize with this, what that number comes from is that at the time the plan was originally created, the projection was that Maine would be losing 65,000 people from its workforce by 2030 due to primarily just our aging population. I keep hitting this lamp, I'm sorry. Sorry to this lamp. The goal then was to say, not only are we going to reverse that decline, but we actually want to aim a little higher and say we're going to add 10,000 more beyond where we were. So that's how you arrive at that 75,000. We're gonna pull up from that projected decline of 65,000, and we're gonna shoot a little bit beyond that and go for 75,000 total from where we could end up. So this is one that is trending in the right direction right now, I would say. Currently we are kind of where we would need to be if we're going to achieve this 5 years from now. But the work is far from done due to the nature of this is kind of an ongoing thing, which I'll get to in a second, and that people are going to continue to retire, and time continues on. And so it doesn't mean that because we're kind of in a good direction now over the last few years, things have trended up. There's still more to be done. I do want to just put another look at this. So this is kind of the demographic situation where that goal stems from in terms of why it's important. So what this is a population pyramid. I always put that in air quotes. It's not a pyramid in this case, but this is the shape of Maine's population by age. So each of those bands is a 5-year age bracket. I know you can't read the numbers on the side, but you don't need to. It's just that as you go up, the age goes up, right? So you can see this bulge, which is around, actually the largest for the state is age 60 to 64. And you can see as you get into younger generations, it kind of shrinks suddenly, actually, and then is straight down and then shrinks again for the youngest band there. Statewide, there's about 30,000 more people will reach retirement age over the next 5 years than will reach prime workforce age. Meaning there's about 30,000 more people aged 60 to 64 than who are aged 20 to 24. So that's a substantial gap, and that's why I say we are moving in the right direction, but that doesn't mean that the challenge is over. There's still going to be that shift to contend with, and this is for Knox County specifically. So same type of chart, but it's just for Knox County in particular. I should also say the yellow and blue is gender, so female on the right, male on the left. So it's a similar shape for the county. In some ways, it's a little more extreme, but very similar overall. And it's not as severe nationally. This conversation does happen somewhat about, the nation overall. Are there enough people to kind of sustain our workforce as baby boomers retire and so on? But you can see it's a much flatter line down. And in fact, the millennial generation and around that age is the largest, or even a little younger, I think. That's, like 25 to 29 is the largest band currently. So it's a different shape in the U.S., and it is still a challenge nationally, but it is different here in Maine. Another thing I just want to touch on, but I won't spend a huge amount of time on it, but I know it's a focus of yours as well, is housing. That continues to be a real challenge around the state, including for workforce, in part because we have seen good trends in terms of workforce, in terms of people moving in, and other factors that has obviously affected housing prices, which is then kind of compounds the issue of, well, then it's harder to attract people. But what this chart is showing, the U.S., this is a housing transaction index, so it's just a measure of housing prices is the easiest way to think about it. The U.S. is in that kind of green line, and then Maine is blue. And you can see, this is going all the way back to 1975. And you can see, it's had periods where it has kind of shot up before, but since 2020, it really has been a real break. And I know it says this at the top, but so 100 is set for January 2020. So you can kind of count up where Maine is at. When I took this, that meant that the housing transaction index was about 70% higher than it was in January 2020. So rapid change, rapid change. Do you have any questions about this data piece of it? Yes.
So in your slide where you showed GDP per worker, you compared Maine with the United States. Why didn't you compare Maine with other rural communities for a better indication of how Maine is doing?
Yes, well, I can make a great plug now, which is that we are going to have a data tool on a web page, hopefully in a couple months, where you will be able to do that. You can pick whatever state you want. And Maine does perform similarly to other rural states that don't have a big oil and gas sector, because that shows up in a major way in GDP, just the way it's measured. So you can end up a little tricky where it's like, well, we still think we can still do better, even if we are kind of in the same neighborhood as some other states like us. But yeah, to that point, we're unlikely to converge fully from the U.S. But part of the reason for having that also was, it's a little hard to tell at this scale, but for that whole period that Maine was flat, the U.S. was growing. So that divergence is part of the reason I point out that longer timeline in the comparison to the U.S. But yeah, thank you for asking that. Hopefully there's something to show on that in a couple months. Thank you. Yes.
I raise a question about immigration, not to be political about it at all. This is not a political question. But in looking at your pyramid graphs that showed actually the United States as being in better shape in a way than Maine, I know immigration is a big part of that.
Yeah.
That's made that possible. And if you took out, and we're a nation of immigrants, and if you took out immigration of the past 20 or 30 years, that pyramid would look dire. And so I'm just, and nations that are not allowing immigration, like China, Japan, well, Germany's allowing immigration, but they all have difficult pyramids. Too few people in the younger categories, too many in the older categories. My question is, what is immigration? What role has it played in our main graph that's been essentially helpful to keep us more younger people coming up?
Yep. No, it has played some role. Maine has seen, I think, more international immigration in the past few years than, or really the past maybe 8 years than, let's say, the 20 or 30 years prior to that. Obviously not on the scale as, the U.S. as a whole. There are other parts of the country that do have more recent immigrants. And it does tend to be that they are more of working age or younger. The reality, though, is that Maine has seen a lot of in-migration just from other states, which that has been Maine, in fact, in these recent years, we have been we've seen one of the highest rates, both nationally and in Maine's history, of in-migration in recent years, which includes both people who are working and are not. Some folks who are retired as well. So it's not everybody is coming to take a job, nor do they need to. But that is part of the story. But the larger number has been just moving from another state as opposed to directly from another country. But it does play a role, absolutely. Yeah, I saw, oh.
Then go ahead.
Yeah.
Somebody else go first.
So just in your first graph, and I can ask you after the meeting if it gets involved, but the wages versus not a graph, you talked about income.
Yeah.
Knox County's wages, is that adjusted per capita, per employee? And is it fair to say if that you are looking for a workforce which is below 150% of AMI, that they don't have other sources of income? This is it. Is that a fair comparison across the state and the other count, Cumberland versus Knox County?
So I guess, I don't know if I'll answer the fair comparison part exactly, but so the wage is the average wage, so it's all employees receiving a paycheck typically, is the way to think about it. And for somebody who is in a lower or even just more moderate income, that tends to be their sole source of income. Right. Most people don't have investment income, things like that. And that is in fact part of the reason why I think we focus more on wage, because it is a little more comparable county to county. Like there obviously are things that affect it, but if we were only focused on income, the age demographics of a county could skew that more than other things like wage, because retirement income changes things. So that's part of the idea. But is that answering your question?
Yeah, it does. I'd like,
Okay.
Cumberland versus Knox as the only two counties up there. That's a disadvantage for Knox County to attract workers if that's the difference in wages, and it's an honest difference.
Sure. Well, yes. What this is not doing is comparing industry to industry, for better or for worse. I mean, it's if you are a lawyer in Portland, you're probably making more money than pick your industry in Knox County. So that it could be a detriment to attraction if a worker is trying to pick a place to live and they're somewhat agnostic about their job, which is somewhat atypical, but so that is a factor. But I think in terms of the actual individual decision, there are other things that can go into it. I mean, another is cost of living, which I know Knox County certainly struggles with as well in terms of housing, but Portland is not, is having a hard time with that as well, I think it's fair to say. So that, there are a lot of factors that go into it. Yeah, did you have a question? Go away? Okay.
Keep going.
All right, yeah.
Why has it been, why have the wages been stagnant since 2020? And how much would you put on like entrepreneurship, like in the trades? I don't know, I have one contractor who had 3 crews working for him, and now like half of them are all 1099, or you know what I mean? They're all independent. I just, what would you assign to that? Because obviously that's a bad picture, especially with inflation, moving the other way.
Right, well, it's a couple things. So one, on inflation, so this is adjusted for inflation. So that's a big part of the story. So wages were increasing, but costs were increasing. So then it looks flat. Yeah. So that's in terms of just the numbers, why it turns out that way. In terms of
So this could be inflation more than.
well, yeah, exactly. I think that's a big part of the story. The other is what I alluded to in that, in terms of initially in those few years why it was staying flat, is that part of the reason it jumped up so much in 2020 is that there were a lot of those initial COVID-related layoffs, and those disproportionately affected people in the lower wage spectrum, just because of the industries that were more affected, the type of jobs that were more affected. And so, if you're looking at then the average wage, well, those people aren't showing up anymore, so it looks like the average went up. So that was kind of a statistical anomaly that year. So then as those industries started reopening, people were coming back to work, then that was kind of pulling things down, but those wages were also increasing more in those industries than some others. So that's why there's a huge amount of chaos going on. I shouldn't say chaos, but just the natural kind of shifts as of employment and wages behind what is actually just kind of a flat line. So there's a lot that was going into that. I hope that helps get at it some. So yeah, I think I'll move on a little bit into, okay, so what to do about some of this stuff, right? So the framing of the strategy overall is we really need to focus in on the talent, so the workforce, and ensuring that, you know, people are achieving their full potential, as well as innovation. So are we, you know, adopting the best way to do things, you know, new technologies and so on. So I do have kind of an abridged version of this, and I'll explain this in a second. The setup of the strategy is then to focus on 7 key areas kind of under that umbrella. So growing local talent, which means, you know, we have a lot of talented workers in Maine. How do we make sure that they are getting the right training they need, the education they need, and so on, and finding the career path that they need or desire to do the most that they can. Attracting new talent is another strategy, which we kind of talked a little bit about. At a certain point, we do just need more individuals who can work to keep growing our economy, so that's part of it. The third one, which you can't really read up there because of the color, is about growing innovation, basically. So this is around investing in research and development and improving kind of entrepreneurship, things like that, to ensure that, you know, we are kind of growing that business energy. Building connections is the next one. Yeah, you can also look at this in your pamphlets on your table. That's really around broadband. I know it sounds like that's been an interest of your group before as well. I'm not focusing a huge amount on that just for time, but that is a strategy I would say that has gone quite well in recent years. The state did, I believe, just reach its goal in terms of currently every location in the state of Maine is able to access broadband physically. It doesn't mean every house or person has broadband, and that's still kind of the next leap, but quite unlike, say, a decade ago, you know, everywhere in the state, there's some method of connecting to the internet, whether it is a fixed broadband connection or it's mobile or something else. So that's been a huge success and change in recent years. After that, we get into these kind of infrastructure pieces, which is not only kind of hard infrastructure you might think of like roads and so on, but also housing, childcare, the things that enable workers to work, that enable businesses to do business, and those types of things. Followed by, you know, kind of maintaining a predictable business climate. That's the strategy F, or business rules, and you know, how can energy costs be more manageable? How can permitting be more manageable, and things like that. And followed by something that was a little bit novel for this, which was promoting hubs of excellence. So how can we really see where, you know, businesses and schools and education institutions and others in a community can really kind of concentrate on what their strengths are and growing that hub of excellence, so to speak. So the reason I have this set up this way is Joan had shared that there are a few topics that have been of interest for your group, and I did just want to pick out some of the action items within this that relate, even though I know we won't have time to go fully into it. But in that kind of grow local talent piece, there have been a few initiatives that I think have been quite important, and still there's work to be done in terms of figuring out how to sustain them. But expanding free community college has been, I think, enormous initiative, and something that has brought a lot of people into higher education and training that otherwise would not have, and that's very important. Apprenticeships has been another big one that has been more effort there to expand, which is, you know, it's just a very rigorous and fairly well supported by the evidence type of approach to training people, especially in trades. And there has been some improvement there, and there's room to grow as well. Another one that I'm partial to is something called the Maine Career Exploration Program. And if you forget any other program today, do remember that one, especially if you are a part of or know of any businesses that might be interested in having a young person get a paid work experience there. So this has been a program that has allowed young people to have a 75-hour paid work experience to, as the name implies, explore a different career option. And we've had, I think it's about 6,000 students at this point have participated in some form or another in this program. And it's seen quite a lot of success. I mean, not only in just building a skill, but if nothing else, to learn that, you thought you really wanted to be a nurse or something. You go, you try it out, and you're like, well, I actually might pass out if I see blood again, so I'm not going to do that. Just having that, just being able to discover those things when you're 17 instead of 23, and you're already, halfway through college, that if nothing else, has been a pretty huge success of that program, and it's been pretty popular as well. So that's one I'm partial to. I did mention the broadband piece a little bit, and just the thing I would just add to in that particular action item has been that to really be able to offer service all around the state, there has been a lot of effort into the typical or really fundamental technologies in terms of cable and fiber fixed connections, as well as there have been new opportunities in terms of mobile and so on that the state has been able to support to make sure that everyone does have access. So that's been big. I also know that childcare is something that has been of interest for this group, and really is of interest, I think, to everybody. And that's something I don't have a huge amount to share about that, other than there is a dedicated group at the state level that is working on what is, it's a difficult issue. Just the economics of it is challenging. Just how to sustainably support childcare for our workforce has been a challenge, and it is a dedicated kind of work stream, I should say, at the state level. Another relatedly big challenge, of course, is housing. The action kind of within this report was really just to point to we need a bigger strategy around this. And I can make a fun plug, which is that actually starting at 1 o'clock today, there's going to be a presentation on that strategy to the legislative committee that looks at housing and economic development issues. So I don't know what all of you are doing after this, but if you want to watch a legislative hearing, you can tune into the Housing and Economic Development Committee, and I believe it starts at 1 o'clock. And so that's something that our office was a part of. We worked with a couple other offices to get a strategy together. We hired a consulting firm that we've worked with for quite a lot of this to start to identify, what can actually be done to improve housing in the state of Maine. So there's a long list of things, so I won't go through them now or attempt to, but you can learn more there. And the last one I just wanted to mention that kind of gets to this hubs of excellence thing is the idea of really investing in placemaking. And I think that is important for community groups like this, which is, I'm sure you spend a lot of your time, either explicitly or implicitly kind of focused on, how do you make your town a better place in terms of a nice downtown to spend time in, making sure your businesses are open and supported downtown, and just making sure that you have a community that people like living in and feel supported in. So that's a big, somewhat, that can be a difficult thing to put your finger on sometimes if you're looking at state policy and economic development and that type of thing. But it really is fundamental to that feeling of prosperity in the state. So I know that's just kind of touching on a bunch of different stuff, but the full list is also, again, in that little pamphlet you have, and you can read more online. You don't need to try to read this now, I would say. It's a little too much info. But with that, I'll say thank you again. If you have any questions, I know we have maybe 2 minutes. So if anything comes up, I'm happy to take them. Yes, one back there.
One question I would have would be, how do we go about pushing for a higher minimum wage in the state? I know that would affect all of us, both businesses and as consumers. We would assume that extra jump, but when I know, I mean, I don't know whether are we at like 1250 or something, or 750 or 1750, but whatever it is, it's not enough, in my opinion. And I don't know who we should contact, whether it's someone like Vicky Dudera or whichever, but I personally would like to push that quite a bit, and I'd be certainly willing as a consumer in the general concept to absorb that extra cost that would flow to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's something that the legislature is always discussing. So I do think, your local legislator is always a good spot for that, just because I think every session that's always a conversation. It is the current minimum wage. I'm going to forget the exact cents, but it's over $14 at this point. It is tied to inflation, so every year it does go up. In terms of whether that's the right balance, I think that is an ongoing conversation with the legislature, and I think that's probably the right place to plug in.
Well, considering wages have gone up a bit, but housing a lot more, it just means our
Yeah.
young folks can't come here. There's no place to go, can't afford
Right.
it. So, okay, well, thank you for that direction.
Sure.
Mike, hold on, we need the mic,
Oh.
please.
Yeah, so Zoom can hear you, I think.
Thank you. You've been doing this for now how many years?
I've worked for DCD for about 5 years.
Well, for 5 years now.
Yeah.
So you probably got a pretty good idea about a general understanding of this state, its personality, what it does, what it doesn't do.
Sure.
So in the 5 years that you've been working here, what do you see as strengths of this place for this community that's here? But also, what do you see as the deltas? Because I would say, as example, this is a state of vacation land. It's on the license plate, hospitality. So how do you expect anybody to actually get higher wages working primarily in a state that's vacation land?
Right.
But I want to hear what you got to think. Never mind what I got to think.
Well, that is certainly a big question. I'm sure I could try to riff for another 30 minutes about it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, that's an interesting way to put it as well. What's a struggle maybe that I see now? At the risk of just repeating what I've already shared, I mean, how to make this shift as a generation retires, I don't think anybody has figured out anywhere in the world, honestly. I don't think that's unique to Maine, but I think we are in a more acute position in Maine. And I don't know if, that does compound with other things such as, are we seen as a destination for business investment in other types of industries and higher technology industries as well? Right, exactly. So those types of things do have to go together. I mean, because if, one way to accommodate somebody retiring is either you find somebody to replace them or you find a new way of doing things where you actually didn't need as many people as you used to. And so I do kind of see those going together. And I know this is kind of a big picture challenge, but it is one I spend a lot of time thinking about, I suppose, just how to bring together that level and type of investment in a place that maybe in recent years hasn't been seen as a destination for that type of work, while at the same time, making sure that we do have the workforce to sustain what we need.
Clark, can you wait till afterwards, just so we're running out of time?
Well, I'll leave it there then, since we're out of time. But thank you for the questions. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Phoenix has agreed to hang out a little bit if you have more questions. So, Judith, if you could help us out.
It would be my pleasure, and I think I'll ask our speaker if he would draw the ticket. What we do is we draw a ticket, and then